In April of 2013, while on his 700 Club TV show, noted televangelist Pat Robertson answered a question about the spiritual safety of playing video games with this.
I think, the idea is not how close can I get to danger,
Really?
but how far away can I stay from it? I don't know what game you're talking about. I know there's one called Dungeons and Dragons that literally destroyed people's lives. I mean, they got into this thing and it was like demonic.
And just like that, aging geeks such as myself went for the bottle. More so, I mean. But why all the concern, I can hear you ask? After all, it's far from the craziest thing old Pat's ever said.
You know what they do in San Francisco, some of the gay community, they want to get people, so if they've got the stuff, they'll have a ring, you shake hands, and the ring's got a little thing where you cut your finger.
Really?
Yeah, really. I mean, it's that kind of vicious stuff, which would be the equivalent of murder.
And he's got to keep the attention somehow, right? I mean, come on, Phil. The man has an empire to keep up. A weird, sort of scary empire. So what was it about that little Dungeons and Dragons comment that got a lot of us nervous? Well, if you're a gamer from the old school generation like me, something about that attitude toward games smacked of something sinister. Something altogether too familiar.
Something from the past.
Welcome to Geek History, a new series where I'll address various geek topics with eloquence, wit, and only a hint of tasteful nudity. Today's topic is Dungeons & Dragons and the Satanic Panic. We're going to talk about the dysfunctional relationship between Dungeons & Dragons and the 1980s. Just like the first time you ever got drunk, it's ugly, painful, and full of questionable decisions, but from the comfortable distance of time, it's a hell of a lot of fun to remember and analyze. To get to the meaty, delicious heart of the matter, we have to go back 50 years or so and talk about this guy, Anton LaVey. Author, musician, and founder of the Church of Satan. He was a man of many talents. One part priest, one part philosopher, and one part showman, LaVey is credited with a mainstreamification of modern Satanism. He put it into the American public's imagination in a way that hadn't occurred since the Salem witch trials. The actual Church of Satan, as LaVey proselytized, is actually an atheist organization that encourages egoism and pride, with Satan himself being more a mascot than anything else. Their symbols are largely taken from the Christian faiths and warped or inverted as a sign of their rejection of the humility and temperance that Christ preached.
All religions are based on abstinence rather than indulgence, and all religions, therefore, have to be based on fear. Well, we don't feel that fear is necessary to base a religion on. The fact that religions for thousands of years have been telling people what they should do and what they shouldn't do according to the basic whims of a person who might be running the show is very understandable. We're realists, we Satanists, but we also feel that a person has to be good to themselves before they can be good to other people.
I've always liked to think of them as the trolls of the Judeo-Christian world, in it for themselves, never missing an opportunity to thumb their noses at the majority that they loathe.
I'm just excited to see my Lord and Savior Baphomet represented in such glorious Italian stone. I do hope his eyes gaze upon me, and that my allegiance is recognized. I don't know. Notice me, senpai! Notice me!
To the American public, however, Satanism is all about demons, human sacrifices, and drinking the blood of virgins. All the virgins. Too many virgins, in fact. And while the facts were all wrong, it isn't like Anton did a lot to assuage the fears of the world around him.
So what we've done is just reverse the procedure. Instead of trying to free ourselves, we've taken all these hang-ups, we've turned them into useful situations. If you're going to be a sinner, be the best sinner on the block.
And while it's true that Anton LaVey wore many hats, the one thing we don't have any evidence of him being was a gamer. Less than a decade later, in 1974, a couple of gamers named Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson released a game called Dungeons & Dragons. Based heavily on the war games that they played and loved, D&D took the notion of high adventure and Tolkien fantasy and specialized it, making the focus less about the grand wars and nameless soldiers of history, and more about the individual characters and adventures that they went on. For the first time, players took on the role of a single character and developed them. Over the course of several play sessions, a lowly squire could grow into a gallant knight in shining armor, a street urchin could become a dangerous assassin, and a humble wizard's apprentice could grow into a powerful sorcerer. The game was relegated largely to the basements and AV clubs of history, with the majority of players being wargamers and the more specialized sorts of personalities, the kind that enjoyed the idea of pretending to be a dwarf for 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 hours at a time.
A dwarf? I don't want to be a dwarf. I wanted to be like a ninja or a fighter.
Well, dwarves are fighters. They're really good at it.
However, its popularity spread, and it became clear that D&D was on its way to being a cult success. Cult may have been a poor choice of words there. The problem started largely in the 80s. With the rising popularity of the Church of Satan, the sudden political power of the evangelical moral majority, and a full-on war on drugs rearing its head, the country was becoming unrecognizable to a huge swath of the people who, well, panicked. Parents have always worried about their children, but now the news was telling them that one wrong turn could see their babies kidnapped or seduced by drugs, gang violence, or Satan himself. One could argue that this worry caused parents to maybe jump the gun a little bit.
You alright? I learned it by watching you.
Hell, the first time I ever heard of crack was just because Pee Wee Herman thought I might enjoy it.
This is crack. Rock cocaine.
Now, I do want to say, it's easy to brush this off in hindsight as a few people panicking for silly reasons. I mean, we live in the age of the internet. This is not a new concept to us now. Whether it's Scientology or Obama or the female Ghostbusters, someone somewhere believes that the end of civilization as we know it is right around the corner. But this was before the internet. Unified by the evening news and daytime talk shows, the country felt a bit smaller then. And you had supposed experts coming on and telling you that there was something very real out there that you should be afraid of.
Number 4, sexual abuse aimed at destroying faith in God. It's being described by numerous children.
What were the parallels with what the boys have told you and the worship of Satan?
Well, first of all, the sexual abuse, the pornography, which always seems to go hand in hand. The boys talked about how these people actually said, "I hate God," and they used a very deep voice when they talked about that.
The first big bomb went off in the form of Michelle Remembers, a book written by the psychiatrist Lawrence Pazder about his patient and later wife, Michelle Smith, which uncovered through repressed memories a series of alleged satanic rituals that Michelle supposedly took part in. To the shock and amazement of basically no one, the supposed rituals were later found to have never taken place. But America didn't know that in 1980. The first modern account of satanic abuse set off a firestorm that caught just about everything in its wake: music, film and television, and of course, games. With its adventures centered around magic spells, mythical beasts, and a largely polytheistic world, Dungeons & Dragons was an easy target. A deluge of rumors and stories began to circulate among the American public, spurred on by investigations and speculations. People were starting to panic, and they needed something to blame. And history has always shown that when someone needs an easy scapegoat, it's the weirdos who get the shaft. If you were raised in the 80s and 90s, perhaps you heard a story. The story, depending on who you asked, tended to go along the lines of geek plays D&D, geek gets caught up in the furor of a fantasy world, loses grip on reality, and kills himself in the utility tunnels beneath his college campus. The details would shift. Someone would say he was conducting satanic rituals in the steam tunnels. Some argued that he'd killed himself and his favorite D&D character died. Some even said that he just plain got lost and starved to death in the tunnels. But the moral was always the same. D&D is bad. Which is funny because I think the moral should be, don't play in underground utility tunnels. But then I was raised by responsible tunnel-fearing parents. Either way, This tale would form the basis for that urban legend, friend of a friend of a friend screed that would frighten neighborhood parents and pastors for decades to come. All of those stories come back to the same real-life individual, James Dallas Egbert III, a gifted university student at Michigan State University who went missing in 1979 and was, in fact, found in the steam tunnels beneath his school, alive. Sadly, Egbert did kill himself after several attempts, the first being the only one that involved any utility tunnels. A private investigator named William Deere was responsible for the speculation that Dungeons & Dragons had anything to do with it, and capitalized on the situation with a sensationalized book, The Dungeon Master, which was published in 1984. The specifics of his involvement in role-playing games were hazy at best, but the bare bones of the matter was that James Egbert was a tragic and mentally unhealthy young man who had issues that had nothing to do with his recreational hobbies. But just like Michelle remembers, the world didn't know that at the time, because the media ran with William Deere's accounts and wove a tapestry of an urban legend out of speculation, moral panic, newspaper sales, and the occasional six-sided die. Well, maybe four-sided. The myths of Egbert's suicide and instability would go on to inspire books like Hobgoblin and Mazes and Monsters, novels that star role-players who suffer as their favorite role-playing games cause them to lose their grip on reality. Mazes and Monsters was adapted to a low-budget film which I recommend watching for the sheer cheese-tastic genius of a young Tom Hanks, if not for its razor-sharp commentary.
Going to join the Great Hall.
You can't. It's a trap.
I have spells. I'm going to fly.
You don't have enough points. I am the maze controller.
Maze controller?
Yes. And I have absolute authority in this game.
Game?
Game.
JJ, what am I doing here?
Just listen to him say maze controller. It's like he's realized for the first time exactly the script he's working with. So, what's the problem? It's a terrible movie and some kitschy books. Who on earth would take that sort of nonsense seriously?
For instance, one case, the parents saw their child summon Dungeons and Dragons demons into his room before he killed himself. Another case, the kid thought he had the ability to astral travel, coming from the Dungeons and Dragons game, that he could leave his body and come back. And he had rigged it up just according to the rule book so he could do it. He was surrounded by his materials and put a bullet in his head so he could leave his body, and he's never come back.
Plenty of people, as it turned out. In 1982, Patricia Pulling's son, Irving, committed suicide. Losing a child is one of the most tragic things for a parent to go through. It feels unnatural to outlive your own offspring, and most parents are left clutching for answers after the fact. Her son's love of Dungeons and Dragons led Pulling to conclude that he had been cursed by forces within the game itself.
What we thought were just regular composition books with schoolwork in it, and much of the Dungeons and Dragons material, along with this curse he had received in the game that day that he died.
Patricia Pulling founded BAD, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, and began to work with investigators and police in crimes that she felt might have been related to fantasy role-playing. When one investigation in particular determined that D&D was not, in fact, related to the crime, Pulling insisted that it was indicative of a cover-up.
And I said, well, you can't change it. If it's the truth, you can't change it. I mean, children are dying, Ed. Children are dying out there, and people are not telling.
While Pulling was insisting that D&D was a force that could inspire curses and madness, others within the Christian fundamentalist movement would take this a step further. Perhaps the most iconic is Jack Chick, famous for a series of religious comic strips. These Chick tracts covered a variety of subjects, everything from the Catholic Church to homosexuality to Halloween. They were meant to be passed out for free to any potential converts. If you had anything that even somewhat resembled a sin, there was a chick tract with your name on it. And wouldn't you know it, Dungeons & Dragons got a chick tract of its very own. Entitled Dark Dungeons, this comic strip tells the story of Debbie and Marcy, a couple of friends who get caught up in the evil world of role-playing games. Through increased exposure and presumably an absolute ton of Cheetos and pizza delivery, Debbie gains evil powers while Marcy slips rapidly into madness. Eventually, Marcy completely snaps when her character Blackleaf dies. Unable to continue living without her favorite level 10 rogue, she hangs herself, causing any D&D player to wonder why she didn't just roll up a new character or something. Dismayed at her friend's fate, Debbie manages to redeem herself and accept Christ as her personal savior with the help of Mark Trail over here. Like a great deal of chick tracts before it, Dark Dungeons dealt in supreme fabrication and fear-mongering. The story was clearly based on the urban legends of that day and walks a pretty extreme path to justify an intense hatred for orcs and multi-sided dice. I will point out, however, that there are little details in this chick tract that surprise me. For example, who would have thought that the cartoonist would have known to give the DM a Dungeon Master's screen? That's just a little detail that seems to suggest that someone in the creation process may have actually played a session or two of Dungeons & Dragons. Thank goodness they got out alive. Oh, and just like Mazes and Monsters, Dark Dungeons got a movie. Oh boy, did it ever get a movie.
No! Marcy, you didn't have to do that.
It's my fault Blackleaf died. I can't face life alone. Marcy.
Now, to be fair, this 2014 adaptation of Dark Dungeons is clearly not meant to be taken seriously. They throw in stuff about how the role-playing crowd in the college is just too popular to be kicked out, and it all culminates in the worship of the elder god Cthulhu. But the adaptation was given the legal blessing of Jack Chick, proving that one man's satire is another man's deadly serious.
Are you ready for the main event? Yeah! Are you ready to RPG? Yeah! Then let's get ready to RPG! 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 RPG!
And before you suggest that maybe Jack Chick had a better sense of humor than we thought he did, I'd like to remind you, this is a man who thought that you could go to hell for pretending to be a dwarf.
Dwarf?
I don't think he had that big a sense of humor on the subject. Dark Dungeons was followed by an essay by William Sneblin called Straight Talk on Dungeons & Dragons. In this essay, Sneblin claims that designers for D&D approached him and his wife to make sure the spells in their game were authentic. Why did they approach Sneblin, of all people? Because, according to him, he was a practicing Wiccan and Satanist at the time, and was well known for being a prominent sorcerer in the community. Sneblin also has claimed to have been a former practitioner of voodoo, Mormonism, and Freemasonry. Oh, and a vampire. And he knows werewolves. I'm not making that up. Okay. Real talk. I will openly admit that we're going deep down the crazy rabbit hole here. You're thinking, come on, Phil, why are we talking about the ravings of people like this as if they're really a problem? Does anyone believe this stuff? Is it really an issue? And that's a fair point. So for me to properly explain why this is relevant, let's talk about fashion. Just stick with me on this one. A common complaint and point of mockery that some people have for high fashion is that it's completely impractical. Bizarre outfits and completely nonsensical designs that would have no actual use in day-to-day wear. To most people, it just seems absolutely crazy, However, a designer who sees that insane fashion show might see aspects of it that they appreciate, a style or a color or a theme, and so they go back to their studio and incorporate that higher fashion line into their own work, though in a more practical, affordable way. And so the impractical gets broken down into little pieces that make sense for the sort of outfit you'd see in a local store. Well, conspiracy theories are a lot like that. Sure, there are some people who dive straight into it hook, line, and sinker.
Bilderberg is heavily involved in the EU plan and helped hatch it, and it is a Nazi plan. They had Lockheed scandals, just like the big lobbying scandal.
But your average person doesn't do that. They might, however, hear a piece of a theory that somehow resonates with them, and they'll take that little puzzle piece of crazy and work it into their daily lives. It gets watered down into something that they can say without having the neighborhood watch called out on them. This is how you get people who say things like, I mean, obviously the Bilderberg Group controls every level of politics all over the world, but I don't think they're lizard people. I'm not crazy. So it's important to pay attention to the accusations people make, no matter how overblown they might seem upon initial inspection. Not only to understand the mindsets of others, but to recognize the patterns in history and attempt to avoid making them again in the future. Parallel to the incidents of BAD and other anti-D&D movements, a similar song and dance was being administered against the music and entertainment industries at large. In perhaps the most infamous of these instances, the band Judas Priest was put on trial after the parents of two young fans claimed that subliminal, satanic messages in the music caused their sons to lose control and end their lives. That story alone could be the subject of its own documentary. Oh wait, it totally has. But there's no question that the various witch hunts were linked, and those links were forged out of fear, ignorance, and a need for simple answers. Egbert, Pulling, all of these people had horrible things happen to them. Something broke inside of them, and it will take psychologists, sociologists, and other professionals generations to fully understand the hows and whys of these young men who are disillusioned enough to take their own lives. And for many people, the easiest thing to blame is also the simplest. Heavy metal music, games, anything that seems alien and unwholesome to them. It's actually understandable when you put yourself in their position. Instead of having to look into the psychology and difficult questions surrounding the motivations of their children, or even inward at themselves, their parents chose a game of pretend as a scapegoat. And this is troublesome for a couple of reasons. The first being, of course, that Dungeons & Dragons is just a game, and doesn't deserve to be blamed for the tortures and torments of lost and fractured people. But far more importantly, if we're busy blaming our woes on any entertainment that seems a little odd or esoteric to us, it means we're ignoring the actual problems of mental illness, pressure from educational institutions and jobs, and the difficulties of growing up alienated or frayed. The world can be a frightening, terrifying place, and when it gets to the worst of it, all we have are each other. And if we're busy cooking up after-school specials about satanic sacrifices, curses, and conjured demons to explain our fears, then we're missing the real things that go bump in the night. It isn't all bad news, of course. Ultimately, the efforts of writers like Michael Stackpole and Tracy Hickman soundly debunked the extreme claims of BAD and other fervent anti-D&D organizations, and further investigation and clinical study have led the American Association of Suicidology, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and Health and Welfare Canada to determine that there is no link between role-playing games and suicide. BAD itself essentially shut down in the late 90s. Like a lot of overreactions, the panic surrounding D&D died down after a little while. TSR returned to its usual woes, arguing with the Tolkien estate about whether or not they could use the term Hobbit. Any social stigma against role-playing games returned to the usual place of quietly judging someone who chooses to play a dwarf in their friend's basement for hours at a time.
Dwarf?
But the peace, like most peace, would be short-lived. And while the next firing squad wouldn't be aimed at anyone's multi-sided dice or painted miniatures, it would be directed towards something that D&D had heavily influenced: video games. Of course, that's an entirely different story. These days, Dungeons & Dragons continues to enjoy its status as one of the most influential games of all time. In fact, just this year, D&D was inducted into the National Toy Hall of Fame, resting comfortably beside Candyland, Raggedy Ann and Andy, and The Swing. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, D&D stands alongside The Swing in terms of toy importance. In conclusion, Dungeons & Dragons is a survivor. I mean, if you can survive people claiming you're actually an agent of Satan and come out on the other side smelling like roses, that's gotta garner some respect. I mean, who else can do that? It's heavy metal music, Barack Obama, and Dungeons & Dragons. Not too shabby. So no matter what your pastor says, D&D does not lead to Satanism. What does it lead to? Takeout, way too much soda, and if you're lucky, a lot of time spent laughing and playing with your friends. The worst thing D&D has ever bestowed upon the world is that god-awful movie with Jeremy Irons and Marlon Wayans, which, okay, yeah, that one might not be completely forgivable.
Would you like to know more?
The history of the Satanic Panic and Dungeons & Dragons is a lengthy one, and there was no way I would have been able to get to every single aspect of it and have a video finished before the next Olympics. I'm definitely planning on revisiting the subject when it comes to music and other entertainment eventually, but if you're interested in learning more about this time in our history, there are no shortage of resources. For a look at the Satanic Panic in general, you could check out Satanic Panic: Pop Culture Paranoia in the 1980s, a series of essays that covers just about everything you could want to talk about during this time period. There's also Satanic Panic: The Creation of a Contemporary Legend, which is a sociological look at the fear of satanic cults by Jeffrey S. Victor. I would also read We Believe the Children by Richard Beck, which takes a look at the widespread fear of Satanism in the 80s and 90s and its lingering effects in today's world. For some insight into the gaming side of things, I'd recommend Of Dice and Men by David M. Ewald, A Contemporary History and Memoir about D&D, and Playing at the World by John Peterson, which is an incredibly in-depth history of gaming in general. And of course you might have a look at the game itself, which is currently in its 5th edition. If you've never played, the Player's Handbook is always a solid place to begin. A lot of the books I've mentioned from the side of the Panicked are currently out of print, but if you check out eBay or Amazon, you shouldn't have any problem finding copies of The Dungeon Master by William Deere, Michelle Remembers by Michelle Smith and Lawrence Prater, Mazes and Monsters by Ronna Jaffe, and Hobgoblin by John Coyne. Oh, and check out the Chick Tract of Dark Dungeons if you haven't already. You can find PDFs of that on the Chick website. Thank you so much for having a look at this first installment of Geek History. This topic is one that has always been near and dear to my heart, and I've already got a lot of ideas for my next episode. Do you have any geek-related topics that you'd like me to cover? Let me know in the comments and tell your friends. Don't be afraid to shoot me a subscription, or like, or even give me your own insights into the glorious, glorious 80s. Thanks again, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
If Daddy don't sink a little drinky, Daddy gets sad and blue. Sneak a little drinky, sneakity-doo. Sneak a little drinky past you. Sneak a little drinky, sneakity-doo. Sneak a little drinky past you. Sneak a little drinky, sneakity-doo. La-di-da-di-da-da-da.